Um, there we go. And so we will be recording it. We ask that everyone stay on mute. I do have individuals looking at the chat box. So if you have questions as we go, feel free to put your questions in the chat box. I have some questions that I'll be asking Jason to give us his experience on and what he's been seeing, as well as we're going to try to save the last 15 minutes to take questions from all of you all. So with that, we have Jason here with us. And Jason, thank you for coming and having this chat with us today. Can you tell us a little bit about what xylazine is? And also how it's here and how it's present in our drug supply.
So those are two really popular questions that usually knocks most of it out of the park. Xylazine is an animal tranquilizer. There's a lot of misconceptions that it's only large animal. I talked to a veterinarian yesterday and she had just anesthetized some rabbits with it. So it's safe for bunnies and it's also great for large animals. It's part of the reason I'm doing this is kind of to eliminate some of the fear behind it. It's been in our drug supply, we know, for 3 years, probably longer. The reality is we're just aware of it now. Most of the drugs are being sidelined from the veterinary industry, added to fentanyl, because fentanyl is a crappy high. It doesn't last long. It's intense, but doesn't last near as long as it should. And it's kind of a trend that's picked up. Originally, they thought it was only in Philadelphia. When they actually broadened their, when I say they, I'm talking about government stuff and health departments. When they broadened their search for it, they found that it's in most of the states in the United States now. When they went back, they're finding some post-mortem issues they weren't testing for it. So it's an issue that's kind of hits everybody in every state. We are lucky in the state of Maryland to participate in the Center for Harm Reduction Services, and the Maryland Department of Health has offered up free laboratory testing in cahoots with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. That is the most accurate lab in the United States. That's where everybody goes to when they need accuracy. And they have offered up their drug testing to help better understand what's happening in Maryland. So all of our drugs that we have sampled go to NIST, that lab. We're lucky in Maryland to have that. There's states where it's still illegal to test drugs. It's legal to have fentanyl test strips. So being in the county that we're kind of localized in, we're less than an hour from Philadelphia. And all of our drugs come from Philly. The Susquehanna River is a barrier to the south of us that stops drugs going either way. So I was actually talking to some folks the other day. This is more of a slow drip situation where we have a limited population that only has drugs from one location. So I've been kind of gifted the opportunity to be able to talk to each participant a little longer than, say, in Philadelphia or big metropolitan areas. And in doing so, I'm kind of gifted with the information that they've given me. Today, this entire talk is just observation. This is my observation to what has been working, what hasn't worked, and what I've learned through each of the participants.
Awesome, thank you. Now, you mentioned about the drug checking program that we participate in. What substances are you finding xylazine in?
So initially I was like, we're only going to find it in fentanyl. And initially that was coming true. Every sample we sent down tested positive, but we've also found evidence of it in methamphetamine and in some pressed pills. And the pressed pills are the part that kind of got me a little bit. They looked just like green Xanax bars. They passed my test to make sure they look real. They didn't crumble. They looked real. For all intents and purposes, they looked like they came from a pharmaceutical bottle. They came back positive for xylazine also, which is that takes some planning. It's kind of sketchy, but it's tested just about everything. I did call the lab in regards to the fentanyl to see if it was just trace amounts or not. And he said it was substantial enough it wasn't from contamination. So or I meant to say in the methamphetamine, he said it was substantial enough that it wasn't by accidental contamination or like a dirty mixing station or whatever. It more than likely was purposely put there. So it's in a lot. That's why I think we need to have these talks and be part of a larger conversation.
So I know that, if it's a horse tranquilizer and they're putting it in methamphetamine, have you seen any differences in individuals that may come in or you interact with that are taking the combination of those two?
I personally have not, in as much as I have definitely in the past 3 years being in Cecil County, been witness to some different effects from really the fentanyl and xylazine mix. Whereas some folks are, you would expect to have like the hard nod or sleep like a tranquilizer would normally do. And the inverse or the adverse effect is they're hyperactive. And they go from a hyperactive state to kind of a sleepy nod and then back to it. And up until this weekend, I haven't seen it anywhere but Cecil in this county. And this weekend, I was called in to our Hartford County location and actually witnessed the exact same effects. I'm a firm believer in the one county in Cecil, everybody referred to as Fetty Fits. I'm actually a firm believer at this point, after seeing it elsewhere, that this could be an effect of xylazine being in the drug supply. Tranquilizers, some drugs actually make you do the opposite of what they're intended for. In a hospital setting, you see this with like Benadryl and stuff like that, whereas normally it would make you sleepy. This didn't. I'm very suspect. And the reason I called the veterinarian yesterday was to see if this is one of those drugs in other animals that has the inverse, and it's not, but it is related to another veterinary medicine that does have that same effect. So at this point, this is new news, but I really do believe that based on observations that could be a lead to something bigger.
Awesome, thank you. And, since you are a certified wound care nurse and, wounds are, you got into this, maybe not like wounds, but it is up your alley. And we definitely are interested to hear your experience with wounds, with xylazine wounds, anything you can give us, any information. I know that there's other organizations on here that are doing the same work, or might be harm reduction organizations. And there's also some individuals on here from hospitals. So if you could give us a little bit of your experience with xylazine wounds, and maybe how you're treating them, what you're seeing, that would be great.
Sure. This is my bread and butter. I'm passionate about this. I didn't know what a calling was until I fell into Cecil County. So xylazine, as we all know, causes wounds. Not in everybody, but in some people. And in some people, they can be quite devastating. If you Google it, you see these horrible, horrible wounds. And the one thing I'm learning is that's what everybody thinks occurs. Nobody's really out there talking yet about early intervention. So everything bad starts very small. They look like bruises. So in most individuals, if they are prone to getting these wounds, there's sometimes, and I say sometimes because they're not always there, they aren't always in injection sites. They aren't always in the limb you injected in. There are times where you may inject in your right arm and you get a wound on your leg. And a lot of times the connection between the drug use and the actual wound is never made. People think it's a bruise, a spider bite, all the typical, like, I don't know how this wound started, so I'm going to find an excuse for it. I think that with a lot of folks, it gets missed. And the next stage of this wound. So initially the injection wound or the wound itself is a purple splotch. On darkly pigmented skin, it can oftentimes get missed. It looks like a maroon bruise on heavily pigmented skin. On fairly pale people, it can be red to purplish. And sometimes it forms a blister. Other times it doesn't. Underneath the blister, inside the blister is liquid that is pink to purple. And it drains out and it usually gets people a little nervous. Underneath the blistered skin, it's very frail. You could wipe it off. And underneath of that's dead tissue. When this occurs for the majority of people that I've had the experience of taking care of, they don't do anything with it. It's left open and it dries and it forms a flat scab up against the skin. Oftentimes you can live with it. It's doable. It's not an issue. It doesn't cause pain. It's honestly, it's just dead, dry tissue. What happens though over time, like most scabs will build themselves out and they build up like a little lump and a bump. These actually build themselves in. That outer connective, the dead tissue on the outside hasn't broken the edges. So the dried goo or whatever you would call a scab actually builds itself in like a pyramid, but inside. And I've seen some of these that look stable for 6 to 7 months, and the people don't care about it anymore because it's not giving them any pain. It's not giving them problems. And when they've been there that long, they do need to have medical intervention typically. And that's kind of the worst of it. The early intervention, seeing those blisters and bruises and people keeping it covered with a Band-Aid, Neosporin, it doesn't make sense when it's wet, but we found here through trial and error that keeping it covered with a burn dressing that's relatively affordable and a pad on the outside of it actually keeps that tissue moist enough to start its healing process. The haywire ones when you pull up pictures of Philly and Kensington and like all that stuff with xylazine, and you see these nasty, horrible pictures, those actually are more than likely from people injecting around the edges of them. That was a new trend that I wasn't aware of, and that was another gift from Cecil County, being able to actually discuss things with folks. And there's something along with the self-harm element of injecting next to a wound in the addiction process that I believe there's a strong connection. One of my first clients here was one of those folks, and we had to barter with her to stop injecting in her dominant hand because she was destined to lose both when we first met her. People inject around the edge of a wound because they feel there's no more vein access anywhere on their body. It's easy. The edges of the wound are filled with fluid it's just kind of pinkish reddish, and when you stick a needle in it, it really looks like it's blood, or it has the flash that some people look for, and it's not blood. It's very close to skin popping, and what happens over time, people just give up hope and will continuously erode their wounds with these tiny little wounds, and a lot of little wounds make a giant one. And those are kind of the horror stories. When you see those wounds, they don't happen overnight. Those terrible pictures of folks leading to amputation is not just the first time they got this wound or the first time they inject.
I think he froze. Is he froze on just in the chat box? Did he freeze? Jason, you're muted. I just lost power. Did you, or did you keep going? Just
I know, I
checking.
tried to. I got disconnected. I'm back on now.
That was weird. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, I was
Um,
completely frozen. I thought it was just me.
yeah, I thought it was me too, so I don't know where it was, but thank you. Yeah, love Zoom.
So anyway, when you have the wounds on the hands, you for peers, if you ask if there are any other spots, this can be a moment to pull into your peer expertise and kind of motivationally interview people into sharing some more wounds. Don't be surprised if you find a big patch of dead skin on the shin, leg. It's usually readily accessible. An interesting fact is that we do not find wounds on the trunk of most people. And that goes back to why the wounds happen. And the best answer is we don't know. There's a lot of theories out there, and all of them seem viable until we get some better information from our research element, like our bigger institutions like Hopkins, Maryland, up in Philly, like Temple. Until we get some really good data from their research end, we're not really going to know why the wounds occur. And this is where the early intervention part plays deep. When you meet somebody with those deep gouged out wounds that are, an inch deep and long, this is where there's a big problem. At that moment, like I feel comfortable with certain people helping heal them at that point. Those guys need hospital treatment. Those wounds in of themselves are complicated to heal. And without having someone, I'm not tooting my horn, but without having someone that's experienced complicated wounds, healing them in the field is very hard to do. And this is where the peers and the hospital folks that are listening come into play, between like EMS, paramedics, that kind of stuff. Recognizing this as a non-infected wound is really important. The majority of folks do not get infected. And this is a weird fact. I happened upon Philly nurse doing the same kind of wound care I was, and she was embarrassed to show me what her wound regimen was because she didn't wash the wounds. I don't wash the wounds either. If people have the opportunity, I will, but the majority of folks, I don't. And the reason being is that they're not dirty, they're not infected. The body does a good job. This is just dead tissue. There's no bacterial infection. That's really important to know. A lot of times in a hospital, when these folks get in front of like a surgeon, surgeons, cutters cut, internal medicine prescribes. That's kind of the way it goes. We've had the opportunity to take care of a young lady who was scheduled for an amputation, and this was in Cecil County. She had a nurse with her, so everything that was told to me was validated through the nurse, and she was scheduled for an amputation, and she left the AMA for other reasons, not drug related. And then she came into my being the next day. I'd never met her before. And this was just a xylazine wound on a knuckle. And recognizing immediately, I just said, look, we already know what we're doing. And you already know you're going to get amputated. So give me a couple days. If I can't turn it around, you can go get it amputated. And we turned it around. She still has her finger, full use of it. And recognizing that was super important because the girl would have had 4 fingers. My whole job is really to keep people's limbs on them and to gain their trust when they need a hospitalization to get them to where they need to go. And sometimes that doesn't look like taking them to a local hospital with limited resources. Sometimes it means taking them to the big guns down in Baltimore, sending out to hand surgeons down there at Union Memorial or at Hopkins, getting them in tune with the right people. But yeah, that's basically the wounds. What we treat it with is a very simple, I know she put it in the chat, an ABD pad, which is an absorbent pad, Zeroform, which is the burn dressing I spoke of. It's got Vaseline and something called bismuth, and Coban. Coban is sticky gauze, whatever people call it. People up here refer to it as sticky gauze, but it's the tan, or it comes in a bunch of colors, that will stick to itself. And rolled gauze if they don't want to use that. Some people are picky. The reason with the difference, some people like to unroll and they still inject into that limb. It gives me nightmares. The first rule of thumb is, like, if you start to get wounds in a limb, to give that limb a chance to like cool down a little bit, go into another site, like another arm or another leg. The folks that continuously take down their dressings, we won't use Coban because that's a one sticky, done sticky. We use the roll gauze, the conforming roll gauze to secure the dressing. And those wounds typically don't heal until they stop injecting in that limb. And this is where, again, with peers, it goes back to using harm reduction tactics. Always, try to inject closer up the line, like 1 inch closer to your heart. If you start to get a wound lower, don't go lower than the wound because you're only causing more damage. Xylazine's devastating in arteries. We've seen more people in this county lose their fingers from like a hot shot, like an arterial shot at their wrist than I've ever seen. And I did this in Baltimore City for a while as well. I've never seen so many people losing their fingers because the drug itself causes constriction. It causes tightening of the artery and spasming, and sometimes you don't get that back. Sometimes it just clamps down and you end up totally, like I ran into a girl the other day, 4 months ago. I found the picture the other day. 4 months ago, she came in with blue fingers and was asking for help. And I told her she needed to go to the hospital. She refused at the time. I requested her to come back. She never did. And the next time I saw her was the other day with no fingers, no thumb, and her first 2 fingers were gone. And if in that moment, it's purely from xylazine. A hot shot will destroy your arteries. Usually people bounce back from it. The ones closer to the wrist with xylazine are just devastating to your fingertips. I've seen a bunch recently, and folks know, when you get an artery, they're accustomed to that. They're not accustomed to the effects of xylazine though.
So, you mentioned a couple, I picked up on a couple harm reduction tips in there that, you use frequently for individuals with xylazine wounds. I went on the very first one with you years ago, and I, heard, the individual had bilateral, both hands. I mean, the wounds on both hands, it was nothing, and I was a peer, nothing like I had ever seen before. I could not believe that, this individual was not laying in a hospital somewhere. And, one of the harm reduction tips that I witnessed you tell that lady that day in that hotel room was, do you want to lose both hands, or do you want to keep your dominant hand? And, she said, I want to keep one of my hands. And one of the harm reduction tips I witnessed you say is, then just please stop injecting in your right hand. And if anyone has seen the post in the newspaper a while ago, this individual, she did lose, is it her left hand? She lost one of her hands, but she has full use of her hand healed. And that was a harm reduction tip that helped her be, and now she is a person she's coming up on long-term recovery. This individual is now in recovery a year out and is actually applying to work in our harm reduction program. So that was one harm reduction tip that I've heard you say over and over. Are there other harm reduction tips that you would give either to the participant or maybe peers or nurses doing this work that they could give individuals?
Sure. One of my other favorites is let the limb cool down. So if you do have wounds in one arm, like rotate your injection sites. Don't, just because you have a wound doesn't mean it can't heal. A lot of times folks will focus on one end or one wound and just destroy that limb. And it doesn't necessarily need to be like that. I've had very complicated people, once they get a kind of a pattern down, will inject into one arm for like a week and a half, 2 weeks, and then go to a leg, go to the next leg, go back to the arm that was needing to chill out. And you by that point, you've given it 3-4 weeks worth of time to start healing. It's complicated to heal once you get to that level. Some of the other tips we've given out, and I'm not really sure the ramifications. In the beginning, we weren't sure why these wounds are being caused. Initially, it was thought that maybe leaky injection site or missed shots, and sure, they definitely cause wounds. Then I watched someone actually beautifully hit a vein better than any nurse I've ever seen, backhanded with a tiny little insulin syringe, and they ended up with a wound. So that put me right back to the drawing board. Even getting a good shot or a good injection site will still leave you with a wound if you're prone to them, or if you picked the bad card that day. For a time, we were telling people just gently tap the tip of the syringe onto an alcohol pad. All of the insulin syringes have a coating on the needle itself that makes it more slippery. Because remember, they're made for insulin. They're supposed to go into like fat tissue and be painless. So when people are cooking up their drugs, pulling it up can leave a little drip on the outside of the syringe. When you're injecting or pulling juices out of an insulin bottle, it has a rubber stopper that kind of acts like a squeegee. Will dry it off. So initially, and this was felt through Philly as well, possibly just tapping the needle. You don't want to damage that coating, so rubbing alcohol on it is not welcome. That could pull the coating off and end up adding debris into the wound field. Like you might inject or end up leaving part of that silicone coating in the wound bed itself. That's the fear. Whether that's fact or not is beyond me, but that's something that it always gets me nervous when they say there's coatings on things. The other, some people say absolutely cook it up. Heat may break it down. The amount of heat, after some research, the amount of heat necessary to break down the xylazine is pretty great, and you're probably not going to reach it with a cooker. There's other harm reduction tricks, and this you guys are the first ones to hear this publicly. So we have a gentleman with really bad hands. He's near and dear to me. He's kind of become a friend through this whole process, and we've healed him multiple times. But he, like I said before, is addicted to injecting into the wounds for the self-harm and all the other stuff that goes into it. So I couldn't come up with a way that he wasn't going to injure himself. And when you think you're at dead end, some like a little light bulb goes off. He was talking about just squirting it up his nose, and we've talked about that before. He was snorting for a while, and snorting it gives you wounds. The mucous membranes dry out. You end up with a bloody mess. And he was talking about just taking a little insulin syringe, spraying it up his nose, but he was still getting irritation, sinus problems. So we actually explored using screw-on devices that hospitals use to make regular syringes, like your Flonase. It sprays out like that, a fine mist, and it requires a little bit more drugs, like another bag or so for a day's worth, but he wasn't getting wounds. We battled this for a while. He was financially stable enough to purchase an extra bag or two a day. What I think got the best of him was that the self-harm part and the needle, that part of his ritual was really, that part of his ritual was very important to him with the syringe and the self-harm part. And we learned that wasn't always working for him with the up the nose thing, but that little screw-on device works wonders. I've tried it with one other person that was only snorting, and I gave them a larger syringe, like a 3 cc hospital syringe, and it was like a gift from God to them. And they were on their way out of doing drugs, and I haven't seen them since. So I don't know how they fared, but it's been that was a good experience seeing the gentleman give his hands a break.
Awesome. Thank you. I know you could talk about wounds all day when it comes to xylazine, and I know that there's probably some questions, so I want to make sure we leave room for questions. I do want to touch on one more, well, kind of two more things if we have time. So can you tell us, and I know you already touched on it a little bit, but can you tell us the difference you're seeing with overdoses when it pertains to xylazine, and any important information we need to know around overdoses?
So I'm going to refer back to just lived experience. We've had the luck, and it took time, but the police department dropped off a lady that was picked up off the highway, obliterated, and she was listed as an overdose. The officer said this is an overdose, never given naloxone, because she was upright. So, I mean, by definition, it's not quite an overdose. She was walking, but she was super intoxicated. This is a trooper. I mean, this lady's somebody that everybody in this community knows well, and for running hard. We had about 15 minutes. So the officer picked her up, got her here. It was about 45 minutes from pickup to drop off, another 15 to get her into the building. She went to the restroom and it was like a light switch. When she was in the restroom, the lights went out. But she was breathing perfectly. So she was slightly arousable. We got her up with a lot of assistance with the team. This is a team sport, by the way. You can't do this by yourself. We got her into a comfortable chair. She had a broken arm. I was helping redress some wounds on her, and she just fell out, and she fell out hard. So at this moment, the team itself, our team, was really nervous because by definition, this really looks like an overdose. But we were an hour into intoxication, usually out of the window for like the fentanyl hit. And by experience, about 30 to 45 minutes, you hit the hard part of xylazine. It can last for 4 to 5 hours. So I hung tight for a while, about another 45 minutes with her. She was breathing like a baby. At this point, it was like we could weekend in Bernie's this woman, take her to the middle of the highway, undress her, take all of her stuff and leave her there, and she would never have woken up. We had never administered naloxone. Her breathing was perfect. And this is this is going to test our skills with when and how to administer overdose medication. For EMS, this isn't going to be, like a naloxone drip and it solves it, or, give your nasal two doses of nasal and start a drip. None of that will work. Xylazine, as I said in the beginning, is a tranquilizer. It's an alpha-2 agonist, and it reacts in the body differently than opiates. So naloxone doesn't work. That doesn't mean don't give naloxone. If it's a suspected overdose and the breathing is slowing, absolutely give it. In this situation, she hit us an hour afterwards and her breathing never slowed. It actually seemed like her breathing got better when she went out. She became more relaxed. I don't think her hand was bothering her anymore. And she had actually reached a level, like she was actually breathing clear enough that it sounded like someone had eaten a big meal. So we sat with her and I left. And by the time I got home, I called back and I called back 2 more times throughout the night. And by the end of it, I texted to check up, and it was 4.5 hours before she was arousable. When she woke up, she asked why we were keeping her here. Like we abducted her. No memory of anything that occurred. Her last memories were on the highway. So it's going to be a test for our peers. It's going to be our test for our law enforcement. Naloxone doesn't work. You give it and they're not arousing, they're not waking up, they're not talking to you like 4 or 5 years ago, even 3 years ago. It's going to require us sitting with that person or finding somebody. And if there's law enforcement on, or if there's any peers working in organizations, I highly recommend this is an opportunity to speak to law enforcement. And we have opened up our doors to be that organization to sit with people. And we're also the organization that will call 911 if something isn't right. So that's the comfort level. And the police kind of know that, I believe. In witnessing that with my own eyes, this is keeping people out of incarceration, out of the hospital, and in a safe place if you have the staff to do it. It's definitely a different, until you see it, until you give, like, when you hear like 3 or 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 doses of naloxone given and the person still isn't awake, your next question needs to be, were they breathing okay? If they're not breathing okay, we might need to perform rescue breathing. And we all have the same boxes. You open up that flap on the front, it tells you to give rescue breaths, and we stopped doing it. It's the rescue breathing part is part of the resuscitation with naloxone. So we need to revisit that. I know we have as an organization, I know we've talked about it. We give out the mask now, the one-way valve mask, for safety, because people don't want to breathe in other people. But yeah, that to me is the biggest thing with overdoses that we really need to be alert for, is they return to breathing, not awake all the time.
Thank you. And the last thing I really wanted to touch on before we opened it up for any questions was, if someone wanted to get into treatment, or, we have peers that are trying to help people get into treatment. What are some things that we need to be aware of? What are the barriers that we're seeing with the xylazine use, wounds, but the use in general getting into treatment?
So this was another learning curve for me. We have participants that really want to get better, but if you have a wound, a lot of facilities will not allow you to enter based on their medical level. For detoxes, a lot of places don't let you come in with these wounds. And there's the first barrier right there. It's getting someone in a healing state that can tend for their own wound and get them into a treatment place. The other part is, once they're there, there is a withdrawal from xylazine, and it can take different manifestations. And I know this from people I've spoken with in both treatment facilities, like providers, and also on the back end, like participants. The failure rate seems to be a lot higher. Even with MAT, folks will just dip out. They'll get to a hefty dose of methadone and still not have the rest of the symptoms managed. And that happens in these facilities as well, like extreme anxiety, sometimes rebound hypertension, like they can get really, really bad blood pressure, almost to the point of needing hospitalization. The one thing we haven't seen, and it could be, I don't know, but is we have not seen seizures from withdrawal. That's a plus. We have seen the blood pressure. Sometimes you can end up with really wonky blood sugars because it does suppress blood sugar production. And with the suppression comes the rebound high afterwards or low. Heart problems like dysrhythmias where you can get weird heart rhythms. I went through the numbers last night. It's rare, but just using xylazine by itself has been attributed to deaths in its own right. There were 2 that I found references to that withdrawal. They couldn't link it to anything else, and there was a xylazine question mark next to it. That's not happening in our state. I was digging deep though, preparing for this, just trying to look through some numbers. But we really need to be aware that wounds will stop people from treatment, and then actually coaching people into like, look, like your feelings are valid. Like you're not lying. You're not. There's really no good medicine. Your standard clonidine that a lot of places give is kind of chemically similar to xylazine, but it doesn't curb the issues. It can help people edge it a little bit, but at this moment, the meds that they use that are being found to be most successful are, you need to be admitted in the ICU to get. So the people that are most successful coming off are the ones they're monitoring with specialty drips that only ICUs can actually give you.
Awesome. Thank you. So, thank you for sharing your experience here in, Cecil County, Harford County. Corinne and Jennifer, were there any questions in the chat box that you wanted to bring up before I open it up for anyone else? I don't know if I missed anything.
Yeah, I have a few that I got from the chat. The first one is someone wanted to know, does it cause severe itching?
So I have not found that to be a thing yet. It does affect people in different ways. The itching is not one that people have told me. Although recently I have heard that the dope in this area have people are itching again, which means it happened in the past. But that could come from another adulterant. But xylazine in and of itself does not typically cause like any of the pruritus or the itching on the skin that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. Another one is, are the wounds only related to IV drug use, or can the wounds appear with smoking the drug of choice?
That's a beautiful question. I have not had the luck of finding anyone that smokes. Unfortunately, since this is only an animal drug, it can't be tested on people. With that being said, there's no studies that are like, hey, smoke this and let me see if you have problems. We've had one young lady that swears she was only smoking fentanyl, and she had pretty unique wounds in her face that I actually sent her to the emergency room. And it was unclear indication of what really caused those. Because she was kind of new to me. We hadn't built up the trust. I don't know if she trusted me. I didn't trust her answers. So I can't say indefinitely. I've heard that smoking does not cause the wounds, but that's anecdotal. I don't have any proof, in its own right.
Okay, and then I have one more. Being that this is a drug for animals, this person is curious if animals also get the wounds.
That's a beautiful question, because that's the same rabbit hole I dug down. So we found one record that in one of the animal pharmaceutical books that you're not to administer it to horses that have lame, it's the area between their hoof and their foot. I forget what it's called, but it can become inflamed, and you're not to administer it to a horse with this issue because wounds can happen. So there is record of wounds, but talking to the vet yesterday, there's not, when they give it to a bunny, they give it in the muscle. So that in and of itself, they don't cause wounds. In larger animals, they give it either in the muscle, if it's a smaller or larger animal, if you will, but most times it's IV, and animals do not get wounds from it.
Okay, thank you. I saw a really good one that just came in the chat. Hold on, where'd it go? Okay, how accurate or reliable are the new xylazine test strips?
So that is a really good question. So I've been on a couple conferences talking to folks that are using them. The false positives tend to be similar to the fentanyl. You could get a false positive with lidocaine, with trying to remember the stuff, methamphetamine, MDMA. It's concentration based, and we have been finding lidocaine in our fentanyl, but it's also been in cahoots with xylazine. So it's going to help in that sense. I believe it's going to help. People know that it's there, but there really isn't an option. It's just like when fentanyl test strips first hit the market, everybody was using them to see if there was fentanyl in it. Then somewhere along the lines, it flipped where people wanted the fentanyl, and they're using it to make sure it had fentanyl, not to see if it did, so they wouldn't choose it. In our area, we don't have the option. Everything has xylazine. I guess since October 2021, when we started testing, probably about 5 samples didn't have it. So it's not really an option. Nobody's going to throw their drugs away. Be like, oh, this has xylazine, I'm going to toss it. I'm not going to use it. Like, I've never met anyone throw their drugs away for any reason. And xylazine doesn't seem like something in my mind that's going to keep my participants from using.
Awesome, thank you. Was that all the questions that you kind of took out of the chat box, Corinne? Okay. So at this time, we do have a couple extra minutes. If anyone has any questions, if you want to raise your virtual hand, and I'll call on you. I got you, Aaron. So, or is it Aaron? Go for it.
You're on mute. There you go.
Awesome, thank you. Jason, amazing. We need a wound care nurse. So if you know of anybody that's as passionate as you are in Howard, that's out there, send them to Howard County. We would love someone as awesome as you. And Aaron, thank you for putting this on. So one of my things was information, rapid access to drug testing. I don't know if you mentioned it. All SSPs have access to it. Okay.
In the beginning, that's the RAD program. Yeah, I don't refer to it by its name. I usually just call it the drug testing program through NIST. Yeah, it is godsend in the state of Maryland.
Yes. So we've seen a lot of stuff come in through that. And yeah, the smoking xylazine, I know it's got to be, because there's some stuff that we've seen, like in cocaine that is fentanyl in cocaine. And if the two, there's a possibility. So I'd like to know what the effects of, smoking it is. This is one other thing I know as a peer, I'm not going to tell someone something before running it by my supervisor and everyone else. Now, you talked about the gentleman that was injecting that's now, open to using an atomizer on the end of his syringe. Well, what if, lived experience. I created things. I watched movies where people were smoking out of things, and you're like, wow, I want to do that too. Well, we give out atomizers all the time. We give out Narcan. Narcan's an atomizer. The reservoir in it, after someone uses it, they throw it away. What if they washed it out, cleaned it out real thorough, and were able to inject what they were doing in there and spray it up? I know I'm not going to give anyone that information, but it's just a good thought. It's kind of like harm reduction information, right?
I can't condone it, but it's a great idea that I've thought of before. I've already taken them apart and used them for training, refilled them with just water to show people. I can't condone it, but yeah, it's an easy atomizer. That's a different thing altogether. I love the thinking though.
Thank you,
I have
Aaron.
one other question, and I'll be quick. You educated us. You educate, I'm sure, peers that you are in, kind of like doing this work on the ground. Are they able to give that information about the wound care with the, dressing it and covering a wound, or do they refer them to you?
So it works both ways. So at Voices, all the peers I usually engage them with me at some point or another. I have a couple that I take out all the time specifically for wound care. They're like my safety net for me, but all the peers that deal in harm reduction know about keeping it covered, keeping it moist. If it's somebody that I haven't seen, and they're usually aware of those folks, they'll put a request in for me to see them. Other folks, I'm the only ones with the advanced dressings. I keep them private. However, it's once there comes a time where I know people are doing the right things, I'll leave supplies for folks there. So they have to go through the peers. Our best tool is our peers, hands down. I'm just a tool for them. So the peers kind of put in a request for me to see somebody after they've already engaged with them, giving them the kind of what's up, this is what's happening kind of thing. We also make public all of the drug testing that we do on a dry erase board in our syringe service location with all the updated bags. All of our stuff comes from Philly. It's all got stamps on it, so it's easily identifiable. And that's always there as a talking point also. So we use both the peer, and then I'm reluctant to allow people to give out dressings only because I have to trust people before. Yeah, it's complicated. Some people try to hide their wounds and are nursing other people, and I kind of sniff them out a little bit. Yeah.
Oh, are you open to mentoring anyone in this type of work? I'd be willing to drive out to Cecil for sure.
We do share days and stuff. The mentoring part's complicated. Like, I didn't just step into this. I have like about 15 years of nursing experience, and 8 of them have been doing wound care. So this is the hard part. I would love to come up with a peer-based wound care program that would help peers and everybody else. It gets complicated with xylazine though. If it were just abscesses, this would be a cut and dry deal. But stay tuned. Yeah, you can reach out to Erin.
Okay, I will.
She's my supervisor. So
Yeah, and I put our information in the chat box for anyone else that has questions after today, or needs to get a hold of Jason or anything like that. But thank you for your questions,
Thank
Erin.
you.
I'm gonna move on and grab some other ones while we have a few minutes. Evelyn.
Hello?
Good
What?
evening, everyone. My name
Oh.
is Evelyn Morales. Jason, thank you for your very informative presentation. I am a certified recovery peer advocate and a clerk at Samaritan Village, Harlem Outpatient. This is foreign language to me. I feel like such a doy, just because there's a first time to hear things and acknowledge them and try to engage in them. So I have never had the opportunity of dealing with someone that has sores and holes and all this other kind of stuff that you're talking about. But now, after being on your presentation, I have a little bit of knowledge. The thing is, right? To me, I mean, is that something that us peers hands-on? No, isn't that a nursing thing? Isn't that a nurse thing that we may refer them to our nurse? Correct me, I'm all lost.
For me, it's a doorway to have a conversation as a peer. The way I utilize peers and peers utilize me. Peers are the doorway into these worlds that I don't have access to. God bless your nurse. She doesn't, or he or doesn't have access, like, unless a peer opens that door. So recognizing this, like, hey, you got some spots on you, and actually beginning that kind of intervention, it's always good. I said earlier, this is a team event. Nothing in this world should be done by yourself. And utilizing your nurse as part of your team and you guys going at this together is important. Every peer along the way, some coaches sit in different positions. Harm reduction, we sit front line. The next level is like navigation. They're not going to be doing wound care. They're not even. They're going to be like, hey, we got a wound care nurse. Hey, we got a wound care peer. Let me call the peer over, and you guys can talk, and that'll get the ball rolling. So it's really just recognizing it. You said it in the beginning of your question. This is, a little bit more than you did before, and that's the intent in this. It's not to be, aghast that you don't know something. When you see it, you'll know it. And then you can say, hey, I think your nurse needs to see this.
I have, now that I think about it, one situation of a young man that uses not crack. Anyway, he says that he has holes and worms. I don't know if that's paranoia from the drug use but he says that he has holes all over his body. But guess what? Evelyn has never said, let me have a look at that, because I don't dare. I mean, I'm like, I don't want nothing to jump out at me. He says he has little worms going in his skin and that he has little holes that go deep inside. So, I listen, I write it on the note, and I tell him you should go to the emergency room and get that checked out, was my suggestion.
That's a perfect suggestion. That's a great suggestion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your presentation. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Yes.
And then we're going to take Ed and then Sarah before we wrap it up for today. So Ed?
Yeah, I have a question. I've been trying to figure out how to phrase it. All right, so xylazine comes in a liquid, right?
Well, maybe, but go ahead.
Then it's dried as a powder, or it comes in a powder.
Right.
It's used to cut the fentanyl. The fentanyl, the product is dumped into a cooker with 1 or 2 or whatever number of cottons. How much residue of xylazine is left in that cooker, and how well does the cotton stop any residue from going up into the syringe? Second question, if there is residue that's in the syringe and it's injected into the vein, does that residue cause blockage? After time, if they repeatedly inject there because there's sediment, the body will reject that sediment, right? Naturally, I think. So does the sediment get a buildup in that vein?
So that's interesting, because last night I was digging deep again, prepping for this. Xylazine is really complicated to filter in anything. Even dialysis can't filter it out. It works so well with the liquid in your body that it dissolves almost instantaneously. And like I said, dialysis can't filter it out because it's bound to the liquid so well. And therein lies the issue. It melts well, it dissolves beautifully. The residue in and of itself, this can come from one person injecting one time, the wounds can form. Whether or not you end up with a buildup in the skin, it's usually other cuts in my experience. In Baltimore City, it's a different drug supply, it's a different kind of thing. And I've seen actual stuff build up in the skin from injection, almost like a tattoo. But we're not seeing that up in this other county that's all Philly drugs. Does that mean it doesn't happen? No. But does it mean that I haven't seen it? Yeah, I haven't seen it yet. That's a great question, though.
Yeah, thank you.
Just one quick question. Is anybody using the Sterafilts?
The ones that come with the kit, the whole kit.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've given them out before
Mhm.
when we didn't have anything else. We just use regular cottons.
Yeah.
No, that not that I know of. They're the ones that screw in the end with the micron filter.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to filter xylazine. Xylazine's just like fentanyl. It's
Okay.
going to creep right in.
All
It's
right.
not the sediment that gets you, it's the actual drug itself.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Ed. And then our last question of the day is going to be from Sarah.
Hey, thank you so much for your presentation. This is fantastic. We're looking for information about this in the Hudson Valley. I have a probably pretty quick question, but you had mentioned folks being prevented from being able to go to inpatient and et cetera because of the wounds. And I was just wondering, because my understanding, and I think what you also echoed, is that they are oftentimes aren't infected. So that's kind of curious to me as to what would be the medical justification of not allowing somebody if it's not something that could spread. Like,
This information, like, it's not been disseminated out medically yet. That's the problem. So this was the First Talk Voices is kind of sponsored. I'm going to go after doctors next.
okay.
This has been a process, like a work in progress. Doctors, there's still emergency room docs that don't know what xylazine is. So
Trust me,
if
I
we,
know. I work with a lot of hospitals. So.
and if we can't get into the emergency room, we're not going to be able to get into the treatment facilities. So
Right.
a treatment facility, like a nurse practitioner that's evaluating people, whether or not they're capable of maintaining their wound care, they're not going to say yes. It's a risk. And that's where the issues come in. The reality is we've actually got some people that were accidentally accepted, and we've worked with a provider at a detox facility, and through a lot of pictures and distance learning, we were able to heal the guy, no antibiotics, the same dressings I use here. And with the guy stayed 60 days, he's clean, he's still sober to this day. And this was over last summer. So it's coming. I don't know what the solution is other than education, and that's why we're tackling this head on like this. You can't research on people, and until like big institutions figure ways to do research for these wounds, we're not going to get them into places that are like, that's tertiary down the food chain for research. Like, treatment facilities aren't on the cutting edge like big hospitals are. So attacking the big hospital to get the information out is the only way we can do it.
Right.
People being familiar with it, and I burn the candle from both ends. I'm teaching every participant that comes in with a wound how to take care of it. And one of the things I found to be most enjoyable and actually the best thing in my whole job is I've changed my practice. Coming out of the hospital, I did everything to people. You do it to them. I learned over the past 3 years here that it's better to do it with someone, because then they can show other people and they can learn to take care of themselves. And a lot of times that's the first time they're ever going to do anything positive for themselves other than like boost in at the Walmart or like walking the street corner for the day. And that's barely positive. They're just getting their drug supply money. This is the first thing people can do for themselves and feel confident in.
Right.
And like teaching them, and then them being confident when they go to a place like, hey, look, I'm here. I want to get better. I want to detox. I've got my bag of wound care supplies because a wound care nurse saw me and I know what's going on and how to treat it. Works to an extent. Only when people are familiar with us as an organization and who I am does it work. And it doesn't always work. It's hit or miss, and you're setting the participant up for a big fail if it doesn't. It's that window of opportunity. You get like a couple minutes of an opportunity if someone wanted to get better. The first time they hit something negative, they're gonna be like, screw it, I'm just gonna get high again. And that's where my fear comes in. We're working with a place trying to get wound care as part of the thing, but it's a long run. It's complicated.
And I mean, sorry, this is a second part, and maybe I'll just email you after. Well, I'll just email you after because I know we're already past. Is the contact information somewhere in the chat?
Yeah, Aaron will give it out.
Yes,
Okay.
I did. So I want to thank everyone for showing up. This was our first virtual chat. We're going to do more. The overwhelming need and request for this information and just these informal chats. So we'll be setting up more in the future. I'm sure things are going to change rapidly. We'll make sure that you all get information to that. We will be sending out the recording from this. So, some people have requested that. So if you registered for this, you will get an email from us, and then you'll have our contact information as well. So if you have any more questions or anything, feel free to reach out to us. And we appreciate spending the last hour talking with us about xylazine. Everyone have a great day. Thank you, Jason, for your expertise.
I appreciate everybody. Thank you.
We
Thanks,
appreciate
Jason. Thanks,
you.
Aaron. Great job, you guys.
Bye.
Bye, bye.
Thank you.